Well, thank you everybody for coming to our third session on beginning Greek for Bible study. In this session, we'll be talking about the meaning of words. So, just kind of looking back on the outline, we first talked about the alphabet, and we went through parts of speech. Now we'll be going over the meaning of words, and next week we'll talk about how those words combine to make sentences. Before we do that, we're going to do a little bit of a recap, and I want to get everybody involved. First, we have the alphabet. That was the first thing we did, remember? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through these letters like alpha, beta, gamma, and I want you to guys say it out loud with me if you know them. And if you don't, just guess it. It's fine. I'll keep going. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mu, nu, xi, omicron, pi, rho, sigma, tau, upsilon, phi, chi, psi, omega. Very good, everybody. Okay, and after that was the first session. In the last session, we were talking about parts of speech, and there were 8 of those that we went over. First one was nouns. Can somebody give me an example of a noun? What's this? A person? Yes, a person is a noun. Very good. Can somebody give me an example of a pronoun?
Word used in place of noun.
Yes, used in place of a noun. So he, she, I, you, those are all examples of pronouns. Can somebody give me an example of a verb?
Running.
Running, yes, that's a verb. And then adjectives describe nouns. What do adverbs describe? Verbs, yes, very good. And then prepositions are words that can describe location or when things happen. Conjunctions, can someone give me an example of a conjunction? And, yeah, how about another one? Or, yes, very good. And then we have the article. What is the article in Greek? Greek only has one article. It's the, right? And then English has another one. What's the other one? A or an. Yep, very good. We looked a lot into the article and how we looked at a number of different uses and how they went back. And we looked at different verses and how those were used. The first was anaphoric, where it just refers back to another word in the sentence. It can be used to state something that's well known. It can state something that is the best of its class or par excellent. And then it can be used to describe something that only refers to one thing. It's the only thing of its class, and that would be monadic. And then lastly, at the very end, we talked about grammatical gender. We have masculine, feminine, and neuter, which is, for the article, is ha, he, and ta. And then adjectives must agree with their nouns and the nouns they modify in gender, and pronouns must agree with their antecedents in gender, that antecedent being what it's referring back to. So yeah, that was just all reviewed to catch us up on everything before we get into the studying of words. But before we do that, we're actually going to go just a little bit into the grammar of nouns, just so as we look up each word, there's some information that I just kind of want to walk you through what that means and to kind of understand it. The first is, we talked about how nouns have grammatical gender. Another thing that nouns have is number. So English and Greek at this point just has singular and plural. So if you think about word, there's only a word, it would just be one word. But if you have words, that is more than one word. So you have the English there word with logos. Logos is singular. And then you have words, plural, which is logoi. And when you look up a word in the dictionary, remember when we're looking through and there's that Greek word on the top and then another Greek word at the bottom. Sometimes it's slightly different. Other times, it was very different. That word on the bottom, that's the lexical form. And the lexical form of a noun is always singular. It's not plural. And the last is case. And we won't be getting into a lot of we won't be talking a lot about what the cases do until next week. But I just wanted to let you know that there's 5 cases in Greek, but there's pretty much only 4 that really get used very often. And that's the nominative, the genitive, the dative, and the accusative. Again, we'll be talking more about what those is, but those are some of the other ways that this applies more to syntax of how a word can change in order to better suit its position in a sentence. You can think about it as he, his, and him. Those are all the same word, but different changing for its place in the sentence. And yeah, more on that in the next week. So, and if you think about, remember, adjectives. Adjectives have to agree in the word they modify in gender. They also have to agree in the word they modify, whether it's singular and plural. And they also have to agree in what case it is. And because the article is a lot like, is in many respects an adjective, we have the 24 forms of the article. So this is one word in Greek, but there's 24 different forms, or 24. Look, as we look in the table, we can see that it's broken up. On the top, you have singular. On the bottom, you have plural, right? And then you have 3 columns. You have masculine, feminine, neuter, and then 4 rows: nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. And you can know sometimes, there's a lot of different variation, but there's also some patterns, right? So if you look at a lot of the times in the genitive and in the dative, when we're looking at masculine, neuter, those are exactly the same, right? 2, the masculine genitive's 2, the neuter is also 2. Masculine is toe, neuter is also toe. So even though we say there's 24 forms, there's a lot of overlap within these forms. And I probably should say this I don't expect you guys to memorize these up front, but I just wanted to show you that this is how it breaks down. Once we have all the pieces for all the different forms that could appear for a word. So yeah, that's just the article as we look around at it. Now, what we're going to do, now that we have some of the grammar out of the way, we're going to be looking at a verse, and that verse is going to be John 1:14. So if you have your Bibles, you can flip to that, or if you're using the Blue Letter Bible app, you can follow along. There we'll be going John 1:14. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at each word, and we're going to be doing a deep dive into that word and talk about its meaning, how it's used in the text. And we're also, I think, is really important, is we can talk about some of the dangers and some of the, you can call them fallacies, that might occur when you look at a word and get the wrong impression of it. So some things to avoid when you're doing word studies. So we have John 1:14. I'm just going to read it out. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, if you might notice that if you're doing the ESV, I'm right now doing the NASB 20, which is slightly different. There is a feature that this Bible study app has for the NASB that I'll show you in just a minute, but that's why I have to use this translation, just to show you how that feature works in just a little bit. So then if I scroll down here, we have the interlinear, and I'm just going to go over this one more time again. We have at the top, we have the English translation. The next word is the inflected form of the word, the form that the word is actually being used in the text. So if we look at this word became, and the word became flesh, we have ageneta, right? That's the word being used in the text. Right below that, we have the transliteration. So the same word, but just written with English characters. And then we have the Strong's number. That's just assigned for searching purposes. And then below that, we have another Greek word. This is the lexical form of the word. So the word that you look up in the dictionary. Then you have the transliteration of that lexical form. So same word, just written in English characters. And then you have some grammatical information. So we get some what's the word, like acronym type stuff here. So if we look at a word like logos, notice if I hover over it, there's a little box that pops down and it says noun. So it's telling me that logos is a noun, and it says it's nominative, singular, masculine. So nominative is the case, right? Singular is the number, it's only referring to one, and the masculine is the gender. So apparently words are masculine. It's just seems kind of arbitrary, but that's what we'll stick with too. And notice we have noun, and in the first word in this acronym, the first letter in the acronym is N. And then there's the dash, right? N dash. That N stands for noun. And then the case is nominative. Nominative is N, which is the second N. Singular, that's the S. Masculine, that's the M. So, as we're going through these are, so yeah, you can hover over them and they'll tell you, write out the grammatical information of that word, but those little acronyms also is more in a condensed form. So then if we go to a word like flesh, it's also a noun. It's nominative, singular, but flesh is feminine, so that's why it has an F instead of an M. So, any questions on anything we've gone over so far? Cool. Okay.
Cheryl, you can move your chair too if you see better from.
Yeah, I just didn't want to interrupt.
Oh, it's okay. Okay, so we'll look at this first word. The word is Kai. Now, Kai is actually a really great word to memorize because it's actually, if I remember correctly, it's the second most common word in all of Greek, and it typically just means and. So, and the word became flesh, and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. So, obviously, you can see and gets used a lot in the pages of Scripture. And if we hover over it, it says it's a conjunction, or it's C-O-N-J is just the first four letters of conjunction. So now I'm going to click on this, the lexical form of the word, and we get some information here. I want to look at, so we have the transliteration, so Kai, we have the pronunciation, and if you click that speaker button, a guy will say the word for you. Part of speech is a conjunction. And then we have some etymology. The etymology of Kai is not something we're going to look into for this one, but we'll talk about more of that with later words.
What does etymology mean?
The etymology is how a word gets made. So as it's how it's composed. So usually like compound words, we'll be looking at those. When you put two words together, you get an etymology, how it's, how that word is formed. Kai, not that interesting. It'll make more sense when we look at, a more interesting word. So as we can see, if we scroll down here, we have dictionary aids, and they actually have Vine's expository dictionary, which is pretty nice. You can click on it, and it will give you a little bit of an entry of just talking about it. But something that I want to point out is the next we have the King James Version translation count. So there's a total, this word is used 9,251 times. So that's a lot of times. And we can look at how the King James Bible, which is a fairly good translation, translates this word. And out of 9,000 times, 8,000 of those times is and. So we can, we're pretty safe bet to call this and. However, there's sometimes where it's translated as also. Sometimes it can be translated as even or both. So just because, something is predominantly translated as and, it's also nice to look at how the other people think it's best to translate a word. But also something to watch out for is you have things like then, so, likewise. Sometimes at the very end, they'll have weird translations. I wouldn't say that Kai ever means then or so. It's just sometimes it's like the way the computer processes it and says, oh, this Kai goes to this, likewise. Well, not really. So I would just focus on the ones that get used a lot, like and, also, even, both. And also even, indeed, but. Those are some examples. So this one, Kai, is, a fairly basic word. It's just a conjunction, but it does get used a lot. Next we have the article. So it's the word, right? It's the word. So in Greek we have ha logos. And if you hover over it, it says it's definite article, and it's nominative, singular, masculine. Something that's kind of funny is that when you look at it, it's saying that the part of speech, when it's making an acronym, is T. Well, why is it T? I think it's because it's the, and the starts with the letter T. So that's why they have it as T-NSM. Just something to be aware of, because A is kind of already taken with adjectives and adverbs. So I guess that's why they chose T, but it's kind of a funny... It's not, when you're thinking article, that's not quite the one, you want to... It's not quite the letter you think about.
It is the third letter in the word article.
guess so. And then you could just pick R because it's article. Yeah, so something I always thought that was kind of funny. Next we have is logos. We already talked about how it's a noun, and in this case, it's nominative, singular, masculine. This one is going to be where we really start looking at different tools that we can use to help us better understand why John would refer to Jesus as the Word. So you can look at Greek inflections of logos. We have different forms that the word takes. Notice how sometimes they usually change the endings for the different parts of speech, and some of those endings are very similar to the article forms we were looking at. So we have logoi here, and if we look back at the plural masculine nominative, we also have oi. So there is some similarities here with how words change. We have Vine's dictionary, and then this is interesting. So the word word logos gets used 330 times in Greek. 218 of those times it's translated as word. 50 of those times is translated as a saying, so similar idea. But 8 of those times is account. Okay, we also have speech. We also have word, parentheses, Christ, so specifically referring to the Word, the divine Word. And then this, I think, is really helpful. We have outline of biblical usage. So it talks about when this word refers to speech. It can be a word uttered by a living voice, embodies a concept or idea. So it can be a word, the sayings of God, a decree, a mandate, or order, stuff like that. You can, keep reading some of those different entries. We get to some really, we get to discourse. We can talk. It sometimes refers to doctrine or teaching, anything reported in a speech. This one I think is really interesting when it talks about sometimes logos can be used as a respect to just the mind, not even what's spoken, but just the reason, the mental faculty of thinking, meditating, reasoning, and calculating. So when we talk about the account of something, right, that's like the retelling, or sometimes it can be for the reasoning behind something, as opposed to just the words themselves. And then this is kind of nice. It gives us actually a little bit of a blurb for how it's used in John. It denotes the essential Word of God, Jesus Christ, the personal wisdom and power in union with God, his minister in creation and government of the universe, the cause of all the world's life, both physical and ethical, which for the procurement of man's salvation put on human nature in the person of Jesus the Messiah, the second person in the Trinity, and shown forth conspicuously from his words and deeds. So it talks about, so we kind of get this idea that, obviously there's some power with it being spoken and, the spoken words and stuff, but there's also that reasoning behind logos. So if you think about logic, that comes from the word logos. Or when we have stuff like biology is the study of life, that ology is actually from logos. And this is also really cool. It talks about, a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus first used the term logos around 600 BC to designate the divine reason or plan with which coordinates a changing universe. So kind of the logos as this order of the divine, this divine order of things. So it kind of just helps us see that John isn't using this word and he's not just picking it out from thin air, right? There is some background to this word. There's some, important information and how this word gets used now or in the past. So we have Strong's definition. We have Thayer's lexicon. This can get sometimes really heady, but there's some good stuff in here too. But something I just want to pull up right here is talking about the difference between diachronics and synachronics. So these are kind of technical words, but right when we're talking about how that word gets used by early philosophers and some of the background of that can be what we call diachronics, is how a word gets used through history. So through the history of the Greek language, how does the word logos get used? Well, obviously it refers to speech a lot, but also that we have that philosopher talking about, the divine order of things. So that is diachronics. And if I have two Greek words here, diachronu. So dia is a preposition that means through, and chronos means time. So through time, that's where diachronics comes from. This is in contrast to synachronics. Synachronics is how a word is used around a certain time period. So whether it's how the speaker uses a word, or people from other nearby countries use a word. So we have soon, chrono. So notice the chronos is a little bit different form. That's because that's just different case. And then soon is a preposition that means with. And we get our word like sync from that, because remember, upsilon sometimes gets transliterated to a Y. So we have with time. So within a certain time period. And so both are really important when we are looking at a word, both diachronics and synachronics. However, it is important to remember that synachronics is more important than diachronics. So how a word gets used in a certain time period, sometimes, knowing a word's origin, its etymology, is really important and helpful. But you can't always take that. You still have to look about how it's used now, because some words change all the time. A good example is the word nice. Back, I think probably even just, early modern times in Shakespeare, nice meant stupid. So if somebody was a nice person, they were, they were a nice person, not very smart. Just because that word used to mean that, some future, historian can't say, oh, now when we use the word nice in 2024, it must mean that we're calling people stupid. No, obviously not. Nice means polite. So words change over time. So even though you can look at both how it was used and how it is used is more important if there's a contradiction. Just because, words change over time. Any questions on diachronics and synachronics? Cool. I think there was something in here that was pretty good. As you can see, it talks about a word, not a word which is uttered by a living voice, implies a concept or idea, and sometimes we'll contrast it with different Greek words, and there'll be different Greek phrases in here and references. What someone has said, a saying, of the sayings of God. So this word gets used in a lot of different ways, and so it's interesting to look about how the different categories of that. Something that I thought was interesting was, let's scroll to the top here. On the right, we have the it's just verses that where this word gets used. So the first time this word gets used in the Bible is Matthew 5:32. And it says, Jesus is speaking, "I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So notice how there is no word used in that whole paragraph. It's not translated as word. But this is why I used the NASB, is because if you're using the NASB on this Blue Letter Bible translation, it'll actually tag the English word with that Strong's number, which, kind of seems, we didn't think about important now, but it marks that word no matter how it gets translated, kind of puts it up there, that G3056. And so we're saying that reason, the word logos here, is being translated as reason. So again, sometimes logos can refer to spoken words, but other times it's just referring to the mental faculty. So don't be just limited in, what this word can mean. There's that's why it's good to look up the word, go through some of these different resources and see, oh, this word can be used a lot, and that helps us better shape our understanding of what John is kind of referring to when he calls Jesus the Word. Yeah. So that's the word. The next word I kind of want to look into. This will be probably less confusing when I say word, because I feel like I've been saying word a million times now. is flesh. So, and the word became flesh. So the Greek word for flesh used here is sarx. So let's click it. So it's sarx, different forms, yada yada. We can see in the King James it's translated as flesh or carnal when we're talking about, earthly desires or stuff that pleases our flesh, and sometimes it's fleshly, so things like that. So we get, very literally it means flesh, like the soft substance on the living body which covers the bones and it's permeated with blood. So obviously just the skin, right? Sometimes it can refer to the whole body, so like the body of a man or things like that. It can also refer to the sensuous nature of man, the animal nature. So sometimes it can refer to it without any suggestion of depravity, but other times it's like the more animal nature with cravings which incite to sin. So we have this, right? It literally just means, flesh. But there's also some of these more means where it can encroach upon like earthly desires and things like that. Things when we want sin as opposed to when we want the things of this world as opposed to the things of God. So if we look at places, and so right here we have, and we can search by books about how a word gets used. And so if we click on Romans, we can look about kind of how Paul uses this word. Says concerning his son who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, for he is not a Jew who's outwardly, nor in circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. There was one that I thought was really, I'm trying to figure out where it was.
Romans 3:20 maybe? None of
mankind. Yeah, so because by the works of the law, none of mankind, or literally no flesh will be justified in his sight. So in this time, flesh is referring to all of mankind. But then we get to verses like Romans 7:5, for while we were in the flesh, the sinful passions. So it's saying that flesh, Paul is saying right here when I'm talking about flesh, I'm referring to sinful passions, which were brought to light by the law, were at work in the parts of our bodies to bear fruit for death. So very negative connotations of flesh. And if you do read a lot of Paul's literature, you can get this idea that flesh is a really bad thing. For I know that good does not dwell in me, that is my flesh. So everything that is bad about me dwells in my flesh. For the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. We get this really bad, negative idea of what flesh is. And so when we go back to John 1:14, are we saying that Jesus became all this really bad stuff about flesh? Well, that might be, what you think if you're just used to reading Paul. But now let's look at John. We have, I am the living bread that came down out of heaven. If anyone eats from this bread, he will live forever. And the bread which I will give for the life of the world also is my flesh. So he's not really referring to it in such a bad way here in John 6:51. Actually, his flesh is what gives people life. And then truly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourself. So it's a very different idea of sometimes, the flesh of Christ is actually good. My flesh is true food and my blood is true drink. So my point I want to get with this is something that can happen called a hasty generalization. This is one of those fallacies. That just because an author uses a word one way does not mean that all authors have to use that word in the exact same way. So Paul uses flesh in a very specific sense. John also is using that same word, sarx, in a slightly different sense. They're still the same word, so they have similarities, but we can't just assume because Paul is using this word with a negative connotation that John has to use this word in a negative connotation. We have to look at how each author uses a word. And that's the idea of, okay, when we want to look up a word, let's look at the surrounding context first to get an idea. Let's look at how the author uses that word in an idea, and then you branch out. But you don't want to just go to, how Homer uses that word. Because obviously Homer's, very far removed in time and space from John. So you always want to look at the closest you can in that location and then slowly build out. and have the stuff of that's more close define how you understand a word than the things that are far away. Yes.
And I would add to that, including the very context in which the word is found
Yes.
itself.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of these words like logos that is being used intentionally because it has a broad range of meaning, and then John is filling that at times with a very explicit Christian meaning that is being created for the very first time. Like the biblical authors are taking words and then filling them with Christian meanings that they will then, throughout time will sometimes even, usurp their meaning that it had before that. And so the immediate context in which that word is found is that first close in time place. They're not just always stealing words from someone else's usage and they have to only find one that matches. They can create their own words and they can fill other words with a new sense or a new nuance or aspect to it.
Yeah, so that's the difference between diachronics and synachronics. How a word was used, although is sometimes helpful, and we'll see how that can be helpful, is not always the best, because just because someone uses it in the past doesn't mean that John's going to use that word in the exact same way. He's adding this Christian meaning. No one, before has called, the second person of the Trinity Logos before. Even though there is background to that, you really have to focus in on the context. You never want the context to override, you never want, there just something arbitrary to override common sense of what the context presents. Yes, I saw your hand.
So talking about the word sarx and those citations in Romans, even Paul is using the word sarx in different ways within his own book. And so there again, and I'm just asking for your confirmation of this idea, but even there, the local context around that word is going to kind of say if he's talking about it in a negative sense or in a general sense about mankind or a physical sense. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, we can see that there are times where Paul used that word and it has no negative connotation at all. He's just talking about, how we looking at that one word in Romans 1:3 concerning his son who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, which is referring to Jesus here. There's no negative connotation. He's just saying that he's in David's lineage, physically. So there's even a broad range of what Paul uses. We can't just make hasty generalizations. We're going to take this word or how it's used a lot and we're going to say, make every time this word gets used, just this one instance. We always have to be mindful of the context, mindful of the author, things like that. Yes, that was very good. Any other questions on this idea of context and author's usage and stuff like that? Yeah, I think this is good. I think we're learning a lot about Bible study and how we can use tools and learn a lot, but there's also times where we can use tools and we don't want to use them wrong. We just want to use a hammer the way a hammer should be used and not use it like a screwdriver. Okay. So that was sarx. So we have kai, and, ha, the, logos, word, sarx, flesh, became. We could go into this word a whole lot. I'm just going to do some more surface stuff. Notice how this is a verb. Became is a verb. And so we don't really see case and we don't see gender here. We'll talk about actually more about what an aorist middle indicative is next week. But notice how there's just differences between verbs and nouns. Also notice how it's not in Greek. It's kai ha logos sarx ageneta, and the word flesh became. So we'll talk about more of that later of word order. Sometimes the word order in Greek isn't how we would think it would be in English. So when we have to say and the word became flesh, they just said and the word flesh became. But something to remember is ginomai. Actually, ginomai will pop up later. Ginomai is the root, is the lexical form of the word used here to mean become. Next, I think this is another really fun one, is we have and the word became flesh and dwell among us. This word for dwell is askenosen, which the lexical form is skenao. So let's click that real quick. unlike the words that we've been looking at so far, this word is used very infrequently. In the New Testament, it's actually only used 5 times. And in all of these instances, it's being, according to the King James, is translated as dwell. But I think this is some really helpful information. The outline biblical usage, it's to fix one's tabernacle or have one's tabernacle abide or live, to have one's tabernacle or to abide or live in a tabernacle / tent. So, tabernacle, okay, this is not quite how, when we think of dwell, we don't usually, our first thought comes to tabernacling, right? So a tabernacle also, just a tent. So skenao, the Strong's definition says, it means to tent or encamp, figuratively to occupy as a mission or especially to reside, as God did in the tabernacle of old, a symbol of protection and communion. So this has more Old Testament allusion. This word is, when we say, and the word tabernacled among us, it's the idea of the Holy of Holies. Remember when we had the Ark of the Covenant was in the tent. That's the idea that John's trying to get at, is God is pitching his tent among us just like he did back then. Jesus is as real as that Ark of the Covenant, even more real than that, because it's God himself. So just some really interesting imagery there that sometimes you just miss from a normal basic translation of the word just as dwell. Notice that how in John it's only used once and it's in this verse, but in Revelation this actually gets used 4 times, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes there is a little bit of a debate about who wrote Revelation, but I'm fairly certain it's the same one who wrote the Gospel of John and the letters of John. And this is kind of proof of that. It's John is the only one in the Bible who uses this word, and so usually I know I have a certain set of vocabulary words that I use or often employ. John has that too. This is one of the words that he likes to employ, and I think it's really cool how it's being used in Revelation, this end times, and Revelation has a ton of imagery back to the Old Testament. I think that's why a number of people find it really hard to read Revelation, is because it's also really hard to read the Old Testament too, and there's so many similarities. But we have in Revelation 7:15, for this reason they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them. So this idea of the followers of God are going to be in the tabernacle, in the holy place, and he's going to protect them. Just some great imagery here. And we can see, this is what I want to go back and talk about, the Septuagint. So the Septuagint, or usually acronymized, I can't think of the word, usually shortened to just LXX, is a Greek translation of the Old Testament along with other books. So it's called the Septuagint because it's attributed to 70 authors who apparently, 70 writers who worked on translating this work from the Old Testament, which was originally written in Hebrew, into Greek. And so LXX is the Roman numerals for 70. This was, these authors or translators did this around the 3rd century BC. So this is before Jesus comes to the scene. And interestingly enough, most of the Old Testament, that's what OT stands for, quotes by the apostles and Jesus are not quoting the Hebrew scriptures, but quoting the Greek translation of those Hebrew scriptures in the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is most likely the Bible that these Hebrews, like the apostles, would use on a daily basis, was not just the Hebrew text, but the Greek translation of this Hebrew text. So, but then we get to a little interesting conundrum, where because the LXX is a translation, it's not the original autographic copy, it's the LXX is not technically inspired. So there's sometimes where you'll get some Greek translations that aren't the best translation of the Hebrew because this isn't inspired. unless the apostles or Jesus are quoting that scripture in the New Testament and affirming that. So we get this weird, dichotomy of it's not really inspired unless the apostles write it in inspired scripture. Does that kind of make sense? So when the apostles and Jesus use it, now those are their words. Now the Holy Spirit is using those words, effectively, and we can say that that's breathed out by God. So even though the translation is technically not inspired, it can help us understand the diachronics of words used in the Bible. So as my dad was saying before, there's a lot of these words that get more Christian meanings. So, for example, angelos in ancient Greek just means messenger, but in your Bible is pretty much always translated as angel, angelos, angel. So and the people who decided that were these translators of the LXX. So they were like, we're going, and obviously there probably, some more history, but that's how that word gets used in the Septuagint, is when they saw the Hebrew word for angel, they used the Greek word angelos, and that's how it gets used in the New Testament as well. Or we get ecclesia is an assembly of people, calling out an assembly to gather in ancient Greek, but ecclesia in the New Testament, that's always just used to mean church. It's pretty much always translated as church. And that actually has less to do with the Septuagint, but just still on that vein of words that get imputed with more Christian meanings once we get to the New Testament. So I bring that up because what we're actually going to do is first skenao is a verb, right? It means to dwell. But over here it was root words and etymology, right? So they derive the word skenao from the word skenos, which, if we click on it, means tabernacle. So they got the verb to tabernacle from the noun tabernacle. Makes sense. Skenos and skenao obviously have similar sounding words. Yes, it's only actually used twice in the New Testament. However, if we we can view Old Testament results in the LXX or Septuagint. And if we do that, oh no, where did it go? It's only used 0 times. That wasn't right. That was so cool. I don't know what happened to it. Huh. Oh well, maybe it was a slightly different word. I don't know why I did it differently. It's skene. So skenos is masculine and skene is feminine. So again, we have those one's masculine, one's feminine, but there's actually no difference. But skene is actually what's used in the Old Testament, and we have he was the father of those who live in tents or tabernacles, this skenes, in Genesis. But when we look at Exodus, every time God is referring to the tabernacle, the Greek translation of the Hebrew always uses the word skenes, which is the root for skenao. So, according to all that I'm going to show as the pattern of the tabernacles, talking about the tabernacle which the Ark of the Covenant resides. Moreover, you should make the tabernacle with 10 curtains and stuff like that. So this word was used a lot in the Old Testament. So when John is using it here, there's a lot of Old Testament imagery that's coming with it, with Jesus being like that tabernacle, of being the very tabernacling and being the very presence of God, just like the Ark of the Covenant was. So any questions on skenao or anything we talked about with the LXX? Yes?
So you said that if LXX is quoted in the New Testament, then that makes it expired. But the New Testament also quotes, like, books from the Apocrypha?
That becomes a little more interesting. I think there's technically only one time where it's quoted, and there's maybe times where it's alluded. That's kind of a little too complicated to get into right now, because I know I don't have all the answers to that. But yeah, you even have Paul who quotes philosophers to the Greeks, and so in some sense, when Paul is using that and when it's being recorded in Scripture and affirmed in Scripture, that affirmation part, is important. Then there is becomes God breathed, I would say. But just because it doesn't mean that philosopher is now always God breathed. That would be a hasty generalization.
Or it doesn't even mean that phrase that he took from him when the philosopher originally said it was inspired by God.
Yes.
He's saying in the context in which the apostle is using it, for the intention in which he's using it, as he's writing it under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that is inspired by God.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, that becomes inspiration. Kind of gets a little more complicated. But any other questions? Okay. Cool. So we have, and the Word became flesh, and we have that Kai, kind of glossed over it a little bit, but another Kai, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Da-da. So, among. So this is a preposition, because if you hover over it, it says prep, which is just short for preposition. If we look at this, actually you can notice something interesting. This word doesn't have a lot of etymology because it's just a preposition. Prepositions usually don't. But notice how this word, it's a preposition, you can use a ton, almost 3,000 times, but out of 2,000 of those times, almost, it's always translated as in. Not among, as it's being translated here, but in. 163 times, it's by. 140, it's with. 117, it's among. So among is actually way down on this list of translations of n. So why then, in the people, or I think by and large most translations, translate this sentence, and he tabernacled among us as opposed to tabernacled in us? Well, then we get to another fallacy. And that's the word concept fallacy. It's this idea that the most frequent meaning of a word is its base meaning. Or another way of saying it that's a similar idea is that a word's meaning is always its most frequent meaning. So if the word, n pretty much always means in, then it should always mean in, because, that's its most frequent meaning. Well, that is technically, not sound reasoning. We talked about this when we were talking about the article, right? If I know a number of people say, ha in Greek means the. Well, it means the most of the time, but I wouldn't say its base meaning is the, because we looked at about how it individualizes, but we also looked how it provides substance, it substantizes, it makes it a person. We also looked at how it helps structures of sentences. So I would say, the base meaning of the article is the definite article, but I wouldn't say the base meaning is the, just because it has a very broad usage. And so that's the same thing with n. Even though it's most frequently means in, it doesn't always mean among. It doesn't always mean in. In other cases, it's very good translation to translate as among. And now you might be thinking, but doesn't, Jesus doesn't he live in our hearts? Like, isn't that true? Yeah, I would say I would think that's true. But that's just because something is true doesn't mean that that's what this text is trying to communicate to us. We were just in the scripture reading. We were just looking at 1 John chapter 1, so the letter that the apostle wrote, and he was talking about how we have seen him with our own eyes, right? They've witnessed Jesus actually be on the earth. He was really here. That's the same thing that John's trying to get out with the first chapter in his gospel, is that Jesus was really here among us. We could touch him, we could see him, we could hear his voice. It's so even though it's you could say that he is in us, that's not what John's trying to get at in this particular verse. In this verse, he's just talking about how he is among us.
And you can tell that because of the context.
Exactly.
Like, you just read the verse before it, read the verses after it. He's not talking at all about someone living inside of another person.
Yeah, so we're a lot of this we have probably should have read the whole verse before we got in, but we have this as we received into them, he gave the right to become children of God to those who believe in his name. So we're talking about how this word became incarnate, the incarnate word, as some headings will put it. And so that idea of him being among us is really critical to this introduction of John. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah, so a lot of stuff, but I think you guys are doing really well. That's when we run into our second favorite word. Our first one is article. Remember, the article is your friend. The Kai is also your friend too. So he comes in again when we say, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And again, we're talking about just the immediate context. And we saw his glory. Again, we have, this idea of him being ever real, ever physically real, is really important to this introduction. You can't see Jesus if he lives in you, but you can see Jesus if he's among you. And so there wasn't a whole lot I wanted to say about this word. It is interesting that this word also doesn't occur a whole lot. It's only 24 times. A more common Greek word is blepo to mean see. But I think this one is a little more stronger of a word. So as you can see in the outline of biblical usage, it talks about to behold, look upon, view attentively, or contemplate. So it's a little bit more stronger than just, we were glancing and we saw his head, right? We took a good look at him and he's not a ghost. This is actually Jesus. This is actually God. Yeah. So, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have an article, then we have doxa, or doxon in this case, his. So, this is one of those instances where we say, and we saw his glory. Well, the Greek has an article here, so they would be, and we saw his glory, but that's not allowed in Greek, so, in English. In English, when we translate it, that article gets dropped, but it is technically there. In the original language. It just doesn't get translated. The next is we've seen his glory, and then John is going to now describe that glory in more detail, and we see this, he kind of brings more emphasis and more explicitness to this idea of glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So we're talking about where he's trying to make sure that this next phrase is referring back to the glory, not anything else, by repeating that word. It also gives it more emphasis. Glory is a really big, important part of this passage. So, and we've seen his glory. We could look up into that word more, but there's it's a great word to look up. There's just some more interesting stuff that I want to point out with some of these other ones. So, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So, this of the only begotten, this is a fun one. We have, so in here, the word is monogenes, and the lexical form is monogenes. So this is an adjective, and the case is genitive, singular, masculine. So, as we can see, it's A instead of N, because it's an adjective, G, genitive, S, singular, M, masculine. So now let's click on it and do some deep diving. So, really good thing to point out first here is its etymology. This is one that is really, really interesting because this is a compound word. Now, who can tell me what a compound word is?
2 words smushed into one?
Yes, 2 words smushed into a one. So it's kind of, you just take that space and put the 2 nouns together. So this is kind of the same thing. It comes from 2 words, manas and ginomai. Remember, ginomai, I told you to remember that word from before. That was the word that meant became, when the word became flesh. This monogenes has that same root in there. So if we look at manas, we can see that it's translated as only or alone or to be by oneself. So it's the only, and then if we look at, I have to go back to this word, and we look at ginomai. Ginomai can mean to be, so just like Amy when we were talking about how it can just be a being verb. come to pass, blah, 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 blah. It can mean to become, to rise. But there's also sometimes where it can mean, I don't see it here, but so it's also just becoming something or creating something. This more complex idea. So sometimes it can be used to give birth when somebody comes into being. That's this idea of ginomai.
It'd be like be made, I think.
Yes, yeah, be made. So when someone is, becomes born, they are made, right? So we have this word, monogenes, which is only made. So only being, only became, the only thing that became of the Father, as the context tells us. We can look at, it says only begotten or only child. So single of its kind, only, use of only daughters or sons or daughters viewed in relationship to their parents. So this word, even though, again, as this compound word, it refers specifically to children. If you're an only child, you're a monogenes. And it's obviously has a special meaning here because it's used of Christ and denotes that he is the only begotten Son of God. Now let's look at it's only used 9 times, and we see here that there's a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, so he's an only child. So the idea of it being only child, again, we have this glory as the only son from the Father, full of grace and truth. It's used actually a few times in John. This is actually one that I really want to focus in on, is Hebrews 11:17, where it's talking about, the list of heroes in the Bible. And it talks about, so by faith, all these headings were beginning with by faith, so-and-so did this. And it's by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And the one who had received the promises was offering up his only son. So this idea of monogenes is being referred to Isaac here. But that's interesting, because does Abraham only have one child? No. Who is his other child? Ishmael was his other child. So why, when Paul is referring to Isaac here as the only child, what is he trying to get at? It's actually kind of interesting. The NASB has a footnote saying, i.e., only son was Sarah. But the footnotes weren't in the, Paul didn't write that footnote. This is the NSB talking here. So, this is, sometimes when we talk about monogenes, it's not only that it's the only child, but it's also that it's this special child, that it's the only one of its kind. So I'm not trying to get into saying that there's more people in the Trinity than just, the Son. I was, Jesus is the only one who's begotten by the Father. That's a very, large theological term that we can't get into, or else I'll probably speak heresy. But they have councils talking about what it means to be begotten. But it's safe to say Jesus is the only one begotten of the Father. However, it's not just talking about only, but also he's special. Just like Jesus is commonly compared with Isaac. Isaac was the special seed of Abraham, just like Jesus is the special son of the Father. And it gets really interesting with, actually I'm going to, I forgot what the verse was. Something you can do is actually just search up a phrase in the thing, and it'll pop you up to a verse that has that phrase. Romans 8:29, for those whom he foreknew, that is God, he also predestined them to become conformed to the image of his Son, Jesus, so that Jesus would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Well, who are these people? Well, you read it on, it says, those he foreknew. Actually, let's go to that verse real quick. So, and those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. So we're talking about Christians here. These Christians are the ones that are going to be brothers, and as the NSB kindly puts ancestors. This word isn't trying to be exclusive in any sense. We already talked about grammatical gender, and sometimes that doesn't always make sense. So brothers and sisters of Christ. But regardless of how you take this meaning of being, brothers, spiritual brothers of Christ, it's important to remember that Jesus is still the only begotten Son of the Father. When the Father treats us with favor, the only reason he does that is because instead of us, he sees his only begotten. And so that's why we get that special favor. So I want to bring that up because that kind of leads us to, another fallacy called the etymological fallacy, that the origin of a word, how a word is made, in history, must be the meaning of that word. Well, as we already talked about, words can change over time. What was nice yesterday might not be nice today. So you always, I don't think if you say translate monogenes as only begotten, you're committing this etymological fallacy. But you don't want to be too, you just don't want to be too narrow in how you see stuff and only base it off of the origin of a word and how it's composed. There's a number of examples in other words, but I think this was a fairly good one. And as the text says here, you still have to look at synecdoche, how that word gets used in that time period, right? If the author of Hebrews is referring to Isaac as the only begotten, well, that should ring some bells of, well, maybe it doesn't only just mean only son, maybe it has more meaning to it. Does that kind of make sense? We get to really interesting theological terms that we can't completely dive into, but so any questions on the etymological fallacy?
Well,
Yes.
Would that word ever describe Christians, the children of God?
I think there is times where it is used to mean children of God, but never as God's only begotten. So that's only referred to when referring to the Father as to Jesus. Yes. Was there another question? No? Good. Yeah. So, only Jesus is called the only begotten from the Father.
The syntax come from the Synectronics?
Yeah, I think there is something that has to do with that. Because I think it has to do with tax. Might have something to do with the have to do with the structure and the structure with. So like how it's it's kind of like sin is sometimes used like It's like how the words cooperate, right?
Yeah,
How
right.
they synchronize with each other. So I do think it is. I would have to double check that, but yeah.
I was just curious.
Yeah. Okay, so we're almost done, but not quite. So we have, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So we have para is translated here as from, and then notice how it's from Father in Greek. It's para patros. But we supply the article because we know it's definite. We're talking about the Father, the first person of the Trinity, even though there's no article in the Greek. And does somebody want to take a stab at the grammatical the case, number, and gender of patros? Clara, what is the case of patros? Just looking at the little acronym. Well, the N stands for noun, and then we have the dash, and then the first letter is the case.
Genitive?
Genitive, yes. Patros is in the genitive form. Abby, that's that next letter. That's going to be the number. So we had N stands for noun, G stands for genitive, and the next word is going to be the number. So it's either singular or plural.
So we're going down?
If we look at this N, G, S.
Oh,
Does the S stand
I was
for?
looking at something else.
Yeah, this word. Sorry.
I
It's the number. Is it singular or plural?
think it's plural.
So the S stands for singular, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, you did good. You did good. I put you on the spot there. Okay. You should pick. Okay, Russell. What is the gender of this word?
Masculine.
Yes, actually, you're wrong. It's alien, but no, masculine. Father. So this is one of those instances where
them.
the gender actually makes sense. It's fathers are boys, and so
Yeah.
it's so it's a noun. It's genitive, singular, masculine. Very good.
Why does it look nominative, Petros?
Because it's a different kind of noun which has different endings. So
is
it
first
looks
declension?
it's third declensions,
Okay.
which is kind of beyond our scope. But yeah, so sometimes similarities can be deceptive. But
Okay, get that question.
yeah, so notice how it's
But if it had the article,
yes, the
Help
article.
you.
Yeah, so right, the article would say to, and oo is a more common ending for genitives. But we can see that the lexical form is not patros, it's pater, which is nominative, singular, masculine. Remember? So, and then we have full, which is kind of a weird adjective. It's nominative. It's nominative, singular, masculine. But it's referring. Actually, it's. This would be referring back to, I think, the probably the word actually, because it has to agree with it in gender. So, but I won't get. I didn't do enough research into that, so I don't want to overstate what I'm going to say. Next word we're going to really take a close look at is grace, a word we already kind of looked at in Ephesians 2:8. It's a noun, and it's the G is for genitive, the S is for, and the F is for feminine. Yes, very good. 100% on this one. Genitive, singular, feminine. And so, just like the other ones, we can look at it, and we can look at different forms of what it means. But I would like to bring up just some resources that you can use outside of Blue Letter Bible. So, what I have here is Mounce's complete expository dictionary of Old and New Testament words. So it's like a lexicon that has words that get used in the Bible, and then just gives a brief summary about that word and how it's used. So I'm just going to flip. And interestingly enough, this one is actually sorted by the English word. So it's actually helpful to look at this and look at how this word charis is translated. As it's usually translated as grace. So when you look through Mounce, you're actually going to be looking for grace. And it's sorted alphabetically. So let's see if I can get there real quick. Yeah, and so it talks about both how it's used in the Old Testament and also how it's used in the New Testament. But for our purposes, we're going to be looking at New Testament. It says it's charis is translated as grace or favor, the acceptance of and goodness towards those who cannot earn or do not deserve such gain. As in the Old Testament, finding favor in the presence of God means that God has an attitude of kindness towards someone wishing to prosper them. So God is wishing to prosper them. Being highly favored highlights God's decision to bless and use that person for his good purpose. Notice how kind of in contrast to what they might be. They can, he's kind to people despite who they are, even if they're sinners. He can still be gracious to them. Paul acknowledges that God's grace has called and equipped him to be the authoritative apostle of Christ's gospel. So Jesus' mission to the world is seen as the appearance of grace and truth. So I'm going to start with you, Krista. If you just want to look at just the entry, it starts just kind of here and keeps going. You don't have to read anything, but if you just want to look at it, and when you're done, you can pass it around to people so you can kind of take a look at. There's a lot of information. I'm just kind of trying to say the first part. But yeah, so that's Mounce's expository dictionary. I looked it up. It was like $30. You can get on Amazon, Christian Books, Zondervan Publishing, and BillMounce.com. So
books too.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can probably find it in thrift books too. But it was like around $30, and it's fairly helpful. It gives a fairly nice. On some words, it's a little bit longer, but it's very helpful.
That's the root, your name.
What?
Cars.
Okay. So he is full of grace, and it is also full of truth. And you can look up truth in that one too. But I also brought my other friend. Say hi. He's a little shy. the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology, abridged edition, and that's important. So if this is the abridged edition, you don't want to see the not abridged edition. It's actually a volume set. So this one is more focused on just the New Testament aspect of stuff as opposed to the Old Testament, and it's far more lengthier than that one. So even though they're both good, this is a bit of a thicker resource, and this one is actually organized alphabetically with the Greek. So this one you have to remember your alphabet and figure out where it occurs. I think there's also probably an index in the back too. Let's see if I can find the entry for aletheia. Remember, you want to look up the lexical form, not the form that's not the inflected form. So, aletheia. So this one, where that one was like a page, this one is like 4 pages, and the text is even a little bit smaller. So aletheia. So it very nicely breaks it up to how it's used in classical literature. So when we're thinking back to that one slide I had, where way before this time, also talks about how it's used in the Old Testament, how the word translates Hebrew words and how that's used there, and then New Testament usage too. So just an example for the classical stuff. It says, in Homer, aletheia is usually used in contrast to telling a lie or withholding information. However, this is not the only meaning. For example, the word used to describe a woman who is careful, honest, accurate, and reliable. So that's some of the classical usage. But we get to New Testament, it also breaks it up to how certain people use it. So there's a whole entry on the synoptic gospel, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Acts. And then he also has an entry for John. So he goes to John writings. Consideration about words' frequency alone suggests that the importance of truth in John's writing, which contains nearly half of the occurrences of aletheia. So half of the time aletheia gets used, it's in writings written by John. So what this is saying is that can be, that is kind of a tell of how important truth is to John's writing. The discussion should not be whether John reflects a Greek or Hebrew view of the word, but what is the nature of the concept of truth John reflects. John uses this word group regularly in the sense of reality, in contrast to falsehood or mere appearances. And it goes on and talking about different stuff and how slightly variations of it used. And sometimes you can even find the verse. It says, special attention must be used in the given phrase of full of grace and truth, which is, hey, the phrase we were looking at right here. So, yeah, some really interesting stuff. I'm going to start this over with you, Logan, and if you want to take a look at it, just want to make sure it doesn't get, soiled. Yeah, so that one.
Magnifying glass? Sorry.
No, I don't. Yeah, unfortunately, it's kind of, small, but it's that's because they're trying to pack in a lot of information. So, yeah, and that one is actually only it's a lot bigger, but it's only like $35, and you can find it on Amazon. It's also published by Zondervan, and again, Thrift Store probably has it. So,
How much is the non-abridged version?
it's like a volume set. So it's like, imagine that, but 5 of them. I have that one in another Bible study software I use, and that's just really helpful. You can really dive deep just in the abridged version. You can really dive deep in just Blue Letter Bible. So yeah, just trying to make you aware of resources for looking up words. Yeah, so that was the verse. That took us a long time just to go through one verse, but that's just show you how you can use these tools. Yep.
Sounds like a dad.
On the words became and dwelt, when at the bottom
Mm-hmm.
there's the -3s.
Yeah, we'll get more into that next week. About what we're to write. Verbs have a little bit different grammar than nouns do. It actually has a lot more inflection stuff, and that is actually a good way to segment into this next part. Oh, actually, that's what I wanted to do. So just to recap what we were talking about how diachronics, how a word gets used through history, is different than how is important, but also synchronics is more important at how a word gets used in that time period. We talked about hasty generalization. You can't just take one occurrence and make it that all the occurrences of that word. We talked about the Septuagint and what that was. We talked about the word concept fallacy and the etymological fallacy. And next week, which is our last week, little tier, we'll be talking about word order, what those cases do and how that affects word order in Greek. We'll be talking more about verbs and what tense, voice, and mood means. And then lastly, just as a big finale, we'll talk about conditional sentences. And that's where a lot of this stuff all comes together for something that's, something that's just really interesting. Conditional sentences are really interesting in Greek.